Ricardo, over to you.
Thank you, Maria Jose. Welcome everyone to this webinar. So first of all, I have to say that it is a real pleasure to have been invited to moderate this panel. So I was telling the organizers that I'm not so sure that I've done it before this way, but I'm thrilled to do it or to start doing it today. So I'm joined by very close colleagues and friends, people that I've known for many years, even from the University of Havana, most of them. So I'm sure we'll have a productive and sincere discussion about the issues that are pivotal to understanding Cuba's standing these days. So let me now formally introduce the panelists, and then I'll explain the rules of the game for this session. So first, we have Ana Mari Maqueira. Ana Mari is a PhD candidate in economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She earned a master's degree in development economics from the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences in Ecuador, and a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Havana in Cuba. She's currently working on her dissertation project that uses a social reproduction theory lens to understand social reproduction processes in Cuba and develop an analytical model. Her research interests lie in the intersection of feminist political economy, labor, and the distribution in global South countries, particularly Latin America and Cuba. I understand she's joining us from Amherst, Massachusetts. Denise Delgado. Denise Delgado is a PhD candidate as well in public policy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Her research interests focus on the interconnection between international migration, remittances, and development, and their link to policy. In particular, she studies the role of remittances for the Cuban diaspora in the United States, Spain, and Mexico. She was a congressional fellow in the House of Representatives on Capitol Hill and manager of migration, remittances, and development programs at the Inter-American Dialogue. Denise has been invited to present her research at several universities, including Harvard University, the University of Wisconsin, at Madison, and the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Florida International University. She's joining us from Washington, D.C., where I am, so we're almost neighbors. And hopefully we'll be joined as well by Oscar Fernandez. So Oscar earned his PhD in economics from the University of Havana, where he was a professor for 17 years. So he's published several papers about the reform process on the island. And more recently, he became an entrepreneur and now runs a food processing company. And as I said, hopefully Oscar will be joining us from Havana, Cuba. So the rules of the game, I'll say a few words about the topics of the day, and then I'll give the word to the speakers. They'll have roughly 10 minutes initially to make their statements, and then I'll engage in a Q&A session with them, and we'll do our best to reserve some time at the very end of the session for the audience to pose questions and give the speakers the opportunity to answer at least some of them. Okay, moving to the main part of today's sessions. So in 2022, Cuba is going through one of its worst economic moments in several decades. Real GDP stands at 2013 levels, and that is equivalent to a lost decade of growth. Exports and imports are down by a significant margin, and that is evident in the scarcity of produce of all kinds and the endless lines to access them. Remittances, which represent, as we know very well, a key part of foreign exchange earnings for the country, have been substantially reduced, including in-kind shipments. FDI has not yielded the expected results either. And just to illustrate the magnitude of the crisis at the end of 2021, even though the economy was the same size as in 2013, So we can say that, the situation is very different in terms of people's access to goods and services of all kinds. Inflation is running at 30 years high, and the peso is been having like a lot of pressure to depreciate in recent weeks. The causes of this of the ongoing crisis, of course, we know include long-term factors, along with short-term aspects that in the last 2 or 3 years that have been impacting Cuba's economy. The Cuban government itself, then headed a decade ago by Raúl Castro, offered at that time an objective and pragmatic diagnostics of a Cuban model and the Cuban economy, admitting that the Cuban model was exhausted and that it needed to undergo significant reform. However, the remedy applied did not solve the problems. So we have structural problems of the economy that have become entrenched. The oversized state sector, low external competitive, and so on. The transformations implemented in the last decade fell short of addressing Cuba's long-running issues. There were no changes or significant changes, I would say, in state-owned companies, ambivalent attitude towards the private sector, outdated approach to foreign investment, and so on. The Venezuela's economic crisis, Venezuela being a key foreign partner for Cuba, actually Cuba's main trading partner in the last 20 years or so. Even the relationship with China has suffered. During the last 6 years or so, trade with China has been reduced significantly. There's been very little Chinese investment in Cuba, and also a growing debt. The end of the normalization process and the adoption of new sanctions during the Trump administration impacted severely on travel, remittances. Cuba was reinstated again in the terrorist list. The Trump administration enforced the Title III of the Helms-Burton Act that had an impact, on foreign investment as well. And last but not least, we all know the severe consequences of the COVID-19, trade disruptions, tourism collapse, and so on. So I also want to mention a few things that, in my opinion, are very different today compared to the early 90s. So first is overall trust in the government's ability to carry through its own agreed reforms, and the erratic path in the last decade have eroded, in my opinion, the public trust in the capacity of authorities to lead an economic recovery. And at the same time, these days we see competing priorities. Despite the economic slowdown that started in 2016, actually, investment has continued climbing in recent years. Construction of luxury hotels and the expansion of infrastructure in the Mariel Zone, they all coexist with insufficient resources devoted to, for instance, the energy infrastructure. The trade-off between consumption and investment in the 90s took place in an environment in which the prioritized industries paid off relatively quickly. Let's think about international tourism, oil and gas production, and to some extent the biotech sector. So far, it has been different this time. The Cuban population is also very different in many important dimensions. The generational composition has a heavier weight of younger Cubans who were born amid hardships of all kinds and feel less attached to whatever Cuban socialism offers these days. Cuba is also aging very fast. Faster, certainly, than productivity gains that have not materialized. It means that that gap translates into a growing burden for the people. And you add increasing inequality, and it is easy to explain, the visible stagnation and deteriorating living standards across the country. The quality of human capital is also a big concern these days. And the international environment is also very different. In the early 90s, foreign investors and the Western governments approached Cuba for several reasons. Cuba was a virgin plaza for businesses. There was hope that the government would conduct market-oriented reforms. There was people saw potential, investors saw potential over the medium term, and also many hope that the U.S. would lift sanctions in the near future. In recent years, Cuba's inability to repay debt, the cumbersome business environment have deterred potential investors. Foreign firms are also more cautious when it comes to engaging Cuba's economy these days. And the world economy is going through turbulent times, as we know very well. And due to the proximity and its the big Cuban diaspora, Cuba has become recently more connected to the United States. Trade, remittances, travel, and the list goes on. These flows are, of course, very unstable and subject as well to political dynamics. So I want to invite our speakers right now to engage in a conversation about these topics. So I'm glad to now invite Ana Mari to tell us a little bit about her economy and social reproduction processes in Cuba. Ana Mari, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks, Ricardo. And thanks to CDA and WOLA for the opportunity to come here and just exchange some ideas about the current situation in Cuba today and the crisis in general. Before talking more about the impact or the effects of the crisis or the role of households and the family in the current crisis, that is what I will focus mostly. I would just like to add something to the differences that just Ricardo was mentioning about the 90s crisis and the current crisis. I think that a less evident difference, but an important one in my opinion, is that the previous crisis, the 90s, was mainly treated, and I think that mistakenly treated, as just a crisis in production by both the academia and also the official discourse, right? So not also a crisis in social reproduction or in reproduction. So, and what I mean by social reproduction is all the activities and processes that allow the reproduction of life and the reproduction of people's capacity to work, considering that is people's work the main source of wealth in a society. So this includes, of course, all the paid sector, which was the main focus of the 90s crisis, where production uses to be located, but also all the unpaid work done mostly by or within households that allow workers to replenish their energies and get up and go to work next day, and also allow an important part of the care of children and the elderly. So among all these activities and processes of social reproduction, we also have the institutions that participate in this social reproduction, schools, hospitals, etc. That participate in the reproduction of people and their capacity to work, but also the reproduction of the system as a whole, whatever it is. So all of this, or all the organization of all of these elements, shape the social contract, which was also very different back in the 90s than what it is now, in both explicitly and implicitly, both ways. So neither the 90s nor this crisis have been only a crisis in production without also being a crisis in social reproduction. But this current crisis in particular was exacerbated by, of course, the COVID-19, is more obviously a crisis in social reproduction as well. So it is more complex to not make this distinction today, even though, of course, crucial points in social reproduction are still not at the center of the debate within Cuba's policymaking decision processes. So, in conclusion, so I would advocate for the need of a feminist political economy lens to both crises in Cuba, which is something that, in my opinion, has been scarce, if not absent, but that I think that have important consequences for both public policy and the way in which the political discourse portray the ways out to the crisis, and in the ways in which the political discourse and the public policy also prioritize one type of measures over others. So another difference that is very, very related with what I just said is that each crisis has a different preceding social contract or what can be called also reproductive bargain that has implications for the consequences of the expectations and ways out regarding the Cuban social project as a whole. So the social contract or reproductive bargain just refers to the general social arrangement about the distribution of the cost of the crisis and in general the cost of social reproduction, how that distribution would be among the different actors, let's say among the state, the family, the market, the community, and what that arrangement implies. So these arrangements were very different in each preceding moments of each crisis. And I think that this is something to consider when analyzing the consequences and the proposals to face and overcome the crisis in general. So I would like to first to reflect very briefly about why do we care about this, right? Do we care about the macroeconomic consequences of the crisis and the reform? So this is a question that might, of course, be very obvious at first. So, but I think that this is missing from the analysis that economists and politicians in Cuba do about the crisis. And I think that the answer to this question is precisely something that sometimes is missing, right? So why do we care about GDP falling? Why do we care about inflation, about not enough exports, about foreign exchange scarcity, about foreign dependence and high fiscal deficits? So, and precisely a social reproduction approach, what tries to do is to bring the reflection of the answers to these questions to the center of the conversation, right? So the answer seems very obvious. So we do care about this because all of that have consequences over people and over their real lives. However, when we focus the crisis as a crisis just in production and not on social reproduction, and when the official discourse also does that, we are placing the real effects on everyday processes of social reproduction in the second level, as if the macro indicators I just mentioned are an end in themselves and not a mean for a greater end. That in principle could be, of course, the improvement of the living standards of the majority of the Cuban population, but could also entail another dimensions of social justice or sustainability or prosperity or whatever the social contract decides that are the main goals. So in this sense, the family or the household dimension of the crisis is crucial and is one of the main dimensions that from a social reproduction perspective we have to focus on. And this can be analyzed in several ways. So I have just chosen two dimensions that I consider are important and that are, in my opinion, also not enough included in the main analysis toward or regarding the crisis. So one is the role of the households or households strategies to face the crisis, which is very related to the household's contribution to the overall distribution of the cost of social reproduction. And two is the gender effects of the crisis at the family or household level, that this is something that has been more academics, people in academia, and also at the official discourse level are more treated. And that is expressed just not only within the inequalities or inequalities within the households, between, let's say, men and women, but also at more aggregate levels as well. So in general, I think that households as a site for social reproduction, I mean, as an actor that participates actively in the processes that allow people to, of course, live and work, has been insufficiently accounted within the feminist academic production in the island, and especially within the economics discipline. And in this set of economic reforms announced by the government, I think that also has not been sufficiently considered neither. So a household has a side of production and has a side that contributes to the overall economy and needs to be better considered in the analysis and the policy making. So the contribution of the household, mainly through all the amount of unpaid of domestic and care work that is primarily done by women, it's it has a very important contribution for the economy as a whole. And despite that, since the 90s, there have been a continuous process of privatization of reproduction, which means that previously goods and services provided or distributed via collective consumption funds were gradually but continuously provided by household strategies. So despite that this is a fact, that so households continue to be relegated to just, let's say, the private sphere. So this reprivatization of reproduction is more salient since the 2008 onwards. So in the Cuban case, the household production, I mean, all the work done within households, particularly all the unpaid domestic and care work, I would argue, helped to sustain the new features of the distributional arrangement, meaning increasing social protection that is taking place over the last decade or so, and low wages. So we can say that it's a lack of subsidy to the state, in the sense that it makes up for whatever it was provided before by the state, or by the, I prefer to say, by the resources provided by people's work and distributed by the state, because this is an important point that is not also considered within Cuba. So the state in itself doesn't create anything, doesn't create any wealth, it just distributed. So the wealth or whatever can we have within the Cuban society is provided by people's work from within and outside the island. So and now are the families the ones who are responsible for providing those goods and services. And this is even more problematic in conditions of deteriorated purchasing power of income, as the one that we are experiencing with the current high inflation context, and in the lack of transparency of the social contract. That is also another feature of the current model. So I think that the failure to center the crisis as a crisis in social reproduction is reflected, or somehow is the result of ignoring this long claim of feminist economics about what to consider work and what is the contribution of that work and how it's distributed among the different actors, but also among different collective identities, as I said, women and men. So completely considering work as just paid work, something that is done for pay, is very limited in my opinion. And this is reflected, for instance, in the 2019 Constitution, when there is no an explicit acknowledgement of a broad definition of work that also includes the unpaid dimension of it. And it's reflected, of course, in the everyday Cuban lives when you meet two friends meet and one says, what does your mom do for work? And the other person says, no, my mom doesn't work. My mom is just a housewife. And you are, okay. So that's like a kind of typical conversation that you can find. So hopefully the family code, I think that the draft has a good job in recognizing this. And unpaid work is one of the articles, is part of the contribution of the family members, and it should be considered, the article says, for instance, when people get divorced, has part of the contributions, the economic contributions to the family. And I think that's the great thing of the new family, or not the new family, the proposal for the new family code. So, Ricardo, I'm out of time.
Well, I mean, you've exhausted already your 10 minutes, but I mean, perhaps you can say a few more words just to wrap up the initial argument.
Right. So yes, I just want to emphasize that this predominant and limited notion of work might impede the visibilization of all the role of unpaid and domestic unpaid and care labor in the economy. And that's why feminist economists within and outside the island have pointed out toward the importance of measuring unpaid work to highlight inequalities in the distribution of unpaid domestic and care work, as we already know that there exists by the different timing surveys that we have had in the country, but also to try to put in similar terms the contributions. So and the main tool to do this is the timing surveys. So I can expand on this after in the discussion if there are people interested, but let me just mention something. Using timing surveys in the Latin American region, the economic contribution of unpaid work is equivalent to nearly 20% of GDP, and women account for the 70% of that contribution. So in Cuba, we have one estimation publicly available using the 2002 timing survey which is not nationally representative. And that estimation done by economist Teresa Lara represented in 2002 19.6% of GDP at current prices. So just to have a reference, government spending in both education and health sectors in the same year represented 15.26% of the GDP. So there is not a lot of information about the methodology, but I can say that found calculations that I did for one part of my project suggest that the contribution in 2016 is even higher. So using different methods, we can find that for that year, all the contribution of the unpaid domestic and care work was equivalent to 45% of GDP in the lowest band and 65% in the highest. So government spending in both education and health sectors and social security in that year, 2016, were equivalent to 20.6% of GDP. So these numbers suggest that it is not possible to ignore households' contribution to the overall economy. Okay, so in the second point that I want to make was more regarding the gender consequences of the crisis, but I don't want to exhaust the time of the other presenters, so I don't know, Ricardo, if I can talk a little bit about that, or I can maybe leave it for the question section.
Perhaps we can come back to that later on in the Q&A part of the session. I myself have a few questions. I'm sure the audience perhaps have some more. So let's now talk a little bit about another issue that is, as we know, strongly connected to Cuba's economy, and more importantly, how Cuban citizens advance their lives on the island. So I'm talking about remittances. And to do that, I invite now Denise Delgado to give us a few thoughts about how she sees this topic evolving these days. We also know that it's very emotional for many people inside Cuba and outside Cuba, and it's also politically speaking very sensitive as well. So without further ado, Denise, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. I want to thank especially WOLA and CDA for the invitation to participate in this panel, to Maria Carla Novarse and Maria Espinosa, but also to the assistants of Natalie Omod, Isabella Oliver, and Leonardo Gonzalez. Also, thanks to the audience for joining in this conversation. We hope that you have some questions for us. And it is also my pleasure to share some ideas about the Cuban economy, especially in this context of a compounding crisis today, with my colleagues Ricardo Torres, Oscar Fernandez, who has already joined, and Ana Maria Maqueira. So I'm going to focus mainly on the role of remittances, the role that remittances play in different aspects. First, the Cuban economy, then the recipient families, both for family consumption, but also for asset building, including entrepreneurs. And I would also like to touch on the importance for Cuban migrants as well. So first of all, it's important to understand that remittances is a multidimensional issue that is connected at different levels with the crisis that we are seeing today. But let's talk about remittances, what we understand it is. Normally, we understand remittances as a portion of migrants' earnings that they send to support their families in the homeland. In this case, to the Cuban families, the remittances might go through official channels or unofficial channels. It can come also in the pockets of migrants when they visit the island. And it can be either cash money, digital money, goods, products, such as food, clothing, equipment, and other items that are lacking on the Cuban market, including also the support for some services like phone and internet recharges. So remittances play an important role in the Cuban economy, as they are the Cuban's second largest source of foreign revenues after medical services. And this is relevant because remittances have the capacity to support consumption on the island, and reduce poverty, especially among those who receive remittances. So estimations on remittances are difficult, are imprecise, and they vary from official estimations and other parallel consultancy estimations. But an issue here is that there is no public official estimations about Cuban remittances since 2003, like I would say, continuous and transparent information since the Central Bank of Cuba stopped providing remittances data that they used to collect as personal transfers in the balance of payment, which is something that many other countries still doing. And it also helps and support transparency on data and to conduct analysis, for example, as Ana Mari was saying, analyze the impact of EPs and other economic dimensions. But it's understood that around 90% of Cuban remittances are coming from the United States. However, as we know, during the pandemic and also due to the economic crisis, remittances have been decreasing on the island in recent years. And this decline is not only affecting the Cuban economy, but especially the recipient families on the island, as well as entrepreneurs, as we have said, that remittances have the impact on reducing poverty among recipients, but also developing some strategies. So let's talk now about Cuban families and what is the role of remittances for consumption. So in this respect, there is a survey that La Oficina Nacional de Estadísticas e Información conducted in 2016 that shed light on the fact that 94% of remittances were supporting family consumption, especially food purchases, but also supporting education, transportation, and health. And I think that the diversity of issues that remittances support for family consumption are important, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, where, as we know, Cubans abroad were not only worried about their own situation, but for the family situation on the island. So they tried to send money or health items, and sometimes it was difficult due to restrictions on remittances, adding more to their own distress. Particularly on those families that were, there are some cases that just still one member of the family in Cuba and all the other family members have migrated. Many times this person who stays in Cuba is an elder person, and remittances is the way, the source they have for their survival strategies. So we can imagine what happened to that person during the pandemic who had to face an even more difficult situation. So as we are talking about this compounding crisis, I think that the lack of options to send remittances to the family during the pandemic then added to the socio-demographic problem that there is still in Cuba. So in this respect, the Cuban population is getting older. Cuban migration, even the one that is happening today, is mainly of young people from ages from 20 to 40 years old. And this is reducing the workforce turnover in Cuba. And then thinking also about what Ana Mari was sharing with us, we can wonder who takes care of the other ones who stay on the island and how they do it. Well, many times a woman from another family member who stayed in Cuba who has to stop working and outside home and stop receiving paid work to take care of the vulnerable family members staying in Cuba. Or with remittances, family members pay for a caregiver who many times is also another woman and who regularly looks after the elderly or the child, the sick or disabled person on the island. So remittances come to play an important role for the family in the face of insufficient networks of public services to take care of the vulnerable people on the island. And as in the 90s economic crisis, that is the precedent that we have compared to the actual crisis that is happening today. Well, as well as in the 90s, Cuban families used remittances to develop those survival strategies. And with remittances, they cover food, clothing, hygiene products, school materials for the kids to go to school, and other products that were lacking in the market. But something that is different in this case is that in the context of the pandemic and restrictions, they face even more difficulties to support those survival strategies. Nonetheless, there have been a development of the internet access, and that is something different from the 90s that has been supporting families and to be able to communicate and receive also goods and products through online markets and other digital markets that we can talk about that later if we have time. Then remittances, in addition to family consumption, also have an impact on asset building. In this case, sometimes migrants send money to buy or maintain a property like a house or a car, invest in businesses, and even incentivizing savings for their family members. We can recall, for example, that during the relaunch, we had the relaunch of the private initiative in 2011, and then until the end of the former Barack Obama administration, there was a lot of enthusiasm on the island among entrepreneurs to develop small and middle-sized businesses. And as part of that enthusiasm, there were Cuban migrants buying and maintaining a house to develop a family business, or lending money, or investing working capital to develop a business and then capitalize with the new economic opportunities, or only because they wanted to support their family members on the island. So the family members wouldn't be just dependent on remittances, but they could generate their own profits. So as well, we know that migrants have been contributing with new ideas regarding the know-how of the businesses, because they have been learning and have been having new experiences since they migrated. So the diaspora's participation has shown the multiplier effect of remittances on recipients' income, their saving capacity, as well as they have helped generating some new job opportunities in Cuba. But caps on remittances has had an impact on Cuban migrants' capacity to support these private initiatives. And in some cases, remittances could have helped some businesses to survive that they didn't, or in other cases, businesses just did survive because they have some savings coming from all remittances, or because they generated their own profits. But in addition to the restrictions on remittances, there have been other internal factors that influences that maybe the Cuban diaspora's investments in private businesses is not as expected or as they would like to. So in this regard, for example, we know, as we mentioned before, in 2011, the non-state enterprises were relaunched. In 2017, Cuban authorities stopped using new licenses for popular private activities. And then in 2018, they introduced caps on the number of licenses. So the question here is, as we know, there have been new measures to incentivize investments of Cuban migrants nowadays. But the question is whether or how the Cuban government is going to build trust when such instability have been happening during the last years. And here I want to ask, Ricardo, do I have more time to keep talking?
Actually, no.
Okay.
You've exhausted your 10 minutes, but I mean, perhaps 1 more minute so that you can make a conclusion, and then we can expand a little bit on some of these issues in the Q&A part, okay? Go ahead.
Perfect.
Briefly.
Perfect. So I just wanted to add another challenge nowadays for Cuban migrants, and it is that, as we know, in 2018, during the there was a FIU-Cuba poll that shed light on the fact that 46% of Cuban migrants living in South Florida said they would invest in businesses in Cuba if allowed, and that was before the Donald Trump administration restrictions on travel and remittances to Cuba. But since the restrictions, we have seen also some louder Cuban Americans asking to stop sending remittances to the island, because that would benefit only the Cuban government. And as I have explained, that is not the case. But a question here, and I think that will require more in-depth studies, is whether the Cuban diaspora is influenced by the current administrations and leadership in Washington, D.C., or whether it's the other way around. Thank you. We can expand later on other topics.
Thank you, Denise. You mentioned the connection between remittances and the private sector on the island. Already a hot topic, and I'm sure that is going to be even hotter in the coming months and years. So very timely, because finally we were joined by Oscar Fernandez from Havana. You all know that it's always a challenge, speaking from the island technically. So we are very happy that he's here with us. And well, Oscar, now you essentially wear two hats. You are an economist who studied the Cuban system for a long time, but now also an entrepreneur. So I wanted to ask you, what's your perception in terms of the changes in the around the private sector? Because this is one of the few areas where we've seen positive change in the last 2 years. Some say actually because of the pandemic, but definitely during the pandemic, some interesting changes have taken place. So I would like to hear your thoughts on the environment for the entrepreneurs and so on. So no further ado, the floor is yours. Oscar from Havana.
Listening?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for the invitation to take part of this very interesting panel. I'm sorry because I just connected a few minutes ago, so it was impossible to me to hear the rest of the panelists. So I'm going to speak like a newborn in this panel. So thank you, Ricardo, for the question. Yes, I think it's a lot of things are changing in Cuba right now. I think these changes are coming from some years ago in concept, but just now is when you could see these changes on the field. What's happening now is that the government, like some months ago, opened the opportunity to create officially new private enterprises. So the private activity, as all of you know, in Cuba has been permitted, but only as a self-employed for some years ago. But now, just recently, from November, almost 1 year, they approved the possibility to create your own enterprise. So that's what a lot of Cubans have been doing. A lot of entrepreneurs have been doing, reconverting their small businesses that before were just self-employed, what in Cuba we call it trabajador por cuenta propia. And now a lot of them have been transforming this, I would say, simple form of entrepreneurship. They have been transforming this on private enterprises. So that's the main change, I think. It still has a lot of obstacles, a lot of stereotypes, but I feel that a lot of things are changing very quickly because of some context situation. For instance, there is a very deep crisis of supply in Cuba, scarcity of almost everything. So if you want to create a business of producing anything, you will have opportunities because the demand is aiming to buy anything you could supply. So that's a first idea. So if you have an idea in Cuba, if you think you could produce something, you will probably find market. You will probably find no competition, because nothing is being produced right now. Almost nothing is being produced right now in Cuba for the regular or the formal enterprises. I mean, state enterprises. On the other hand, as they have a liquidity crisis, the government has a very important scarcity of foreign currency to import. So imports are also constrained. So no competition from inside, from local enterprises, no competition from importations, same thing. So I think a lot of opportunities are arising right now. And the most important thing is that the enterprises, the state companies, they understood that, and they are open, very open to build associations with the private sector. That's the first idea, because at the government level, I mean, at the official speech, you could find different trends. Like, first of all, the official speech is promoting the private companies, is promoting the linkages or whatever, but then you could find some suspicious idea that the promoting private sector is not good for socialism or whatever. And at sometimes you find in official press articles or opinions from people position it, or from people associated to official governmental official parties. And then the opinions, you could find that maybe it's kind of lack of consensus. But on the field, what you find on the field, what you find when you are in the inside, talking to the state suppliers, for instance, the farmers or state companies in agricultural sector, or when you go to a big enterprise that has a lot of underused capacities, like big storage or machinery, or I don't know, maybe equipments or whatever that they have, they are not using plenty these equipments, then you find a lot of enthusiasm in these state enterprises to make any linkage with you, to build something. So they don't care about the lack of consensus. They have clear goals and they want to go with you. At the end, they have this slow culture of doing business in the state sector. So it could take you like 3 months to sign a simple contract to supply or to buy something, because they are going, they run in a different rhythm. But for instance, all the big sellers, the storage, the stores, the big companies that control the market of retail selling, they are looking for entrepreneurs at any field, from any field, like food production, perfect, manufacturing, perfect, whatever, because they don't have anything to sell at the stores. You go and you see the empty, all the aisles empty, because they don't have anything. No enough money to import, and nobody is producing in Cuba. I mean, of course I'm exaggerating, but it's just for giving you the sense of what is essentially happening right now. So this is what I feel at the end. A lot of state companies want to sign. The rhythm is low, but it's moving on. It's moving forward toward I think a good alliance. Then recently, the government is promoting also a foreign investment in private sector because of the same thing. Because it's the more dynamic sector, because there are a lot of people wanting to do things quickly, and because of the foreign investors are also interested in signing agreements or investing with this private sector because it's dynamic and because it has more autonomy. Of course, it faces less barriers, obstacles in terms of bureaucracy. Okay, but still a lot of challenges are in front. For instance, funding. Funding is one of the most important obstacles we have because we don't have a good financial products, right? Like it's hard to find source of legal funding for investing in Cuba, for importing machinery like capital goods or whatever. So this is one of the most important barriers right now. The governmental banks, they are creating some new financial products that I think are better than in the past. Some options are appearing, but it's still very rudimentary. I don't know if this is the correct word, rudimentary. So it's still not covering all the needs we have for creating these products, these enterprises. So, in the other hand, I feel that they're being creating to a lot of enterprises, private enterprises, dedicated to the provision of services, and not too many people are involved in the production of goods. Because the other hand, I mean, in the other hand, this scarcity, this lack of products is a good opportunity, but at the same time is a big problem, because if you need some supplies from some other industries, so, if you need some inputs, then you practically will need to import all the inputs you need to your production. So it's a challenge right there. And as we have this problem with the exchange rate and with the inexistence of a currency market, if you produce and you sell in Cuban pesos, you don't have the legal.
Okay,
so that's it.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you're back, and if you can sum up, wrap up your ideas in 1 minute or so that we can start the Q&A part, because I want to establish a connection between what you said with what all the other speakers stated at the very beginning of the panel. So go ahead, 1 minute.
Perfect. So summarizing, there are very good linkages going on between private sector and state companies at some level. There are good opportunities right now because the government is promoting this, of building linkages or associations between private sector and foreign investors. There are also good opportunities to build projects linking with the local level of government. There are a lot of opportunities on the scarcity, on the crisis, but at the same time, a lot of challenges. I think the process is non-reversible. I think at this point, it's not possible to go back, even with the lack of consensus they have, because a lot of solutions they will be coming with the hand of this kind of alliance I'm describing right now. So the entrepreneurship on the private sector is going to take advantage of the existence of some capacities in the state sector, and by building these linkages, I think a lot of solutions could come. Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you, Oscar. So, one question that that I have is for you. I mean, when we'll come back to this issue, would be around, well, you've mentioned already some obstacles, but I would like to expand a bit on that. And specifically, I would like you to say a few words about, how do Cuban entrepreneurs secure funding these days? How that has changed or not in the last 2 years? Because, apparently there is a lot of movement. You mentioned, for instance, the fact that the government is now even considering promoting, foreign investment in private companies. That would be a first for Cuba in the last 6 years or so. So think about that. I'll come back to this. But now let me, talk to Ana Mari again. You explained several issues during your initial statement, but I'd like you to comment a bit more on, because as at some point you mentioned that there was something lacking in the, in some of the recent measures that the Cuban government announced in July to tackle the current crisis. So I'd like you to, to say a few words about, how these concepts of, gender, the care economy have been considered or not in these measures. How do you see it? I mean, is there a room for a new type of social policy? This sounds like a lot, but you only have like 3-4 minutes, so be concise, please. So the floor is yours again.
Okay. All right, so I will try. So one of the consequences of ignoring what I've just said in my first intervention is precisely the lack of consideration of these issues in public policy and in government strategies toward recovery. So if you kind of analyze maybe, let's say, the set of measures during COVID-19, when COVID-19 was more, on the measures regarding the contention of the virus took place, you also realize about this, right? So in my opinion, of course, the COVID-19 crisis so didn't create the gender inequalities that we can observe within the economy, but just exacerbated those. So those gender inequalities were already there, and all these problems were already there. So we know right now, even with the lack of data that we have a gap in the labor force participation between men and women, that we have a gap in participation in mainly the non-state sector of regarding also the women's participation, mainly in the private sector that participate more, has high workers. Women in general have less remuneration because they are located in sectors that in general, I'm saying in state-owned sectors that have less average wage. So they participate less in private business as business owners. They have received more remittances for social reproduction purposes than for business entrepreneurships and all of these things. So I look forward to have some information about this in the new SMES sector, the small and medium enterprise sector, but I don't see why it will be substantially different. So, and at the same time, all this is very related, of course, with the inequalities in the unpaid sector. So women, even if they are working for paid almost the same amount of hours as men, they dedicate 9 hours more every week of unpaid work, regardless their employment status. And that difference between, for example, employed and unemployed men is almost zero. So the gender roles are more deeply rooted in rural zones. So these inequalities are even worse for rural women and for non-white women as well. So we already know all of this, but not considering the crisis in this sense also allow for not considering strategies within the public policies in order to face these issues from the very beginning of the design of the policy, not as a response to whatever the consequences are after implementing the policy. So, however, there is a difference in this crisis with respect to the 90s, and it's precisely that it is impossible to ignore all these issues now. So it was easier to kind of not consider that in the 90s, I would say, very like simplistic terms. But the fact that this is not possible to ignore now has caused that there are a few very small steps that needs to be highlighted, although I think that are totally insufficient. So I can mention very briefly, of course, the program for the advancement of women that was approved in 2020. So that is at least a recognition that all these problems exist, although there is no clear or specific strategies on how this is going to be implemented and how this is going to be a linkage to the specific consequences of the crisis itself. All right. So there are small steps also, or those very, I know I have very little information about this, but we know that within the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, there is a program on unpaid work, although I have had no access to what the program entails and everything, and that the National Network on Care that is led by some professors in the sociology faculty at the University of Havana participate, have different professors and different faculties participate on that, have done workshops and have had the conversation with policymakers. So it's the first time that the Ministry of Labor and Social Security recognizes that it's possible or is a duty for them to have also a program for unpaid labor, because that's something that's considering that work is also unpaid work. Right. So still, I don't know the extent to which that program would, have some result, the scope, the time frame. I don't know anything about that, but I think that the fact that the conversation is on the table is something that cannot be ignored. So from the last set of measures announced by the economic minister, Alejandro Gil, with the last intervention, there is only from, I think it was 75 measures, if I remember correctly, something like that. We love to put numbers on what amount of things we do. There is just one measure that will help to support families' strategies, and is the fact that they would like to stimulate in the new non-state enterprises, private and cooperatives, for all the non-state forms of organization of production, the development of places that can have social services for the families in terms of washing clothes or food services for delivery of food and these kind of things. So it's the only measure from the last strategy.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Well, there is much more that we definitely want to cover, but let's leave something for questions from the audience. So I make sure that at least you get one of them. If the other two speakers help me with this, so I would like to touch base again with Denise around remittances, and again, politically, it's a very sensitive issue. There is a lot of back and forth within the Cuban diaspora and also within Cuba in terms of remittances. I have to say that neither side provides an official estimate of remittances to Cuba for obvious reasons. But my question to you right now is, why remittances are not only an economic issue, but also a policy issue, in your opinion? If you can expand on that, 3 minutes max.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So
thank you so much. And I'm going to combine that question with some of the questions that we have on the Q&A that I think that are incredible and very important questions here. And I'm going to start answering why, and the question of Natasha Bannon about how Donald Trump administration restrictions have affected remittances. And I would say that the first limitation was in setting a cap of $1,000 per quarter to send to a close family member. And as we know, remittances for family consumption sometimes not that high, but to support private entrepreneurs, it is high. So in some cases, so conducting research on this topic and on the impact of remittances for private enterprises in Cuba, I have seen even $200,000 sent to support to buy a house or an apartment and then transform that in a business. So not all the amounts are the same, but sometimes are high. So the cap of 1,000 is especially affected the private entrepreneurs. But then the other restrictions on sending remittances to Cuba and traveling to Cuba, the closure of Western Union in Cuba, affected especially the family consumption, the families on the island. Why? Because 50% of Cuban remittances used to enter to Cuba through Western Union, which was the major remittance agencies since the 90s. And while we also know that around over 50% used to go to Cuba through informal channels, people knew Western Union, people trust in Western Union. So that's one of the impacts, family consumption. And additionally, the travel restrictions also limited the remittances that entered to the country in the pockets of Cubans who were visiting, as well as other informal channels like mullahs who usually enter to Cuba with cash money or products to sell or to provide remittances to the family. So something that I think here that is interesting is that what Natasha mentioned is a compounding crisis. It's not only the COVID-19 pandemic, it's not only the Cuban economy, it's all intersected. And for sure, this policy, these restrictions on remittances and traveling to Cuba came to add to that crisis. And while we were seeing at the beginning of the pandemic, like there were countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, like Mexico and Dominican Republic, that experienced an unexpected increase in remittances transactions, then remittances to Cuba, the volumes start decreasing due to the restrictions on remittances that affected not only Cubans in the United States, but around the world. And in fact, as another data to support this comment is that the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean estimated that during 2020, at least remittances declined to the island in 15%. So I think that is something, of course, to be addressed. That is something that implies policies. And I will connect that also with Cindy Ball question that I think is a great question. So, and it has to be with the relationship between remittances, development, and migration, right? So we have these restrictions on remittances. People are living an economic crisis on the island. They don't see, they feel hopeless, as Cindy mentioned. They don't see the opportunity in the middle of the crisis to find survival strategies, and remittances come to be a escape valve. So it's how people call it on the island. So they are escaping through remittances to that situation. Again, they are hopeless. They do this. What I think is very important here as well is that compared to the 90s, this is a risky migration, is irregular migration mostly, but different from the 90s is that they are now coming, they are traveling, they are migrating with the whole family, sometimes with vulnerable members like kids, the elderly, people with disabilities included. So this is adding to the migration crisis in the region, not only to Cuba. Now, an interesting point here is that as migration, remittances, and development are connected, we also know from theory and from other studies in other countries that when you have huge flows of migration, it is more likely to have bigger amounts of remittances coming back, because the new migrants have someone in the home country, they have a family member still, they have friends, they have people that they want to keep supporting. So then they try to find ways to support them. If the policies, the restrictions on remittances are completely lifted, as it has been announced, and put into practice, then the new flow of remittances could diminish, could decrease the flows of migration, especially irregular migration. And I will let other people to answer questions.
Thank you, Denise. Yes, we are running out of time. So I want to thank the audience for the questions that are already in the Q&A part. We'll try to answer at least some of them. So I'll invite the speakers also to take a look at the Q&A in Zoom so that you can go through them, because I'll try to invite you to say a few last words at the very end. And we are approaching that moment already. So take a look, and then you can use that time, limited time, to answer some of them. So, Oscar, I mentioned that would like to know a little bit in terms of how do Cuban entrepreneurs access funding these days to start new ventures. And by the way, there is a question that perhaps you can connect to that, because someone is asking, what is the difference right now that we have former private firms in terms of running a private firm, and being a self-employed, because that category still remains, right, as part of the overall conformation. So the floor is yours. Quickly,
thank
3
you.
minutes.
Thank you, Ricardo. I read the questions and I took notes. First of all, the financing. It's not complex to get a loan in Cuban pesos, because the bank, the basic unit of the bank is authorized to give you a loan. Just demonstrated what you are going to do with the loan. It's not the same like some years ago. At least 3 millions of Cuban pesos, 4 millions of Cuban pesos, 5 millions of Cuban pesos. You could get it. I will say very. It's not quick, okay, but for Cuban standards, it would be acceptable, I would say. But the problem is that you do almost nothing with Cuban pesos, because what you need for starting a business, you need machines, you need tools, and you need to import. But this is the situation right now. There is a joint venture with a Spanish bank, the Financiera Iberoamericana, that is getting some loans. They have a product payable in 3 years. That is a very interesting product. It's not, it's not like something impossible to be analyzed. So the difference between the self-employed and enterprise. First of all, as the Cuban history, I would say to all my friends that want to make a business in Cuba, that this is the moment to become in an enterprise, because you never know when it's going to stop the process, as the history has shown. But not always this is your choice, because if you want to maintain a small business with just your family, like a cafeteria or something like that, it's not a good deal to become in an enterprise. If you want to grow, if you want to go further, if you want to export, or if you want to supply the country or whatever, then you need to become in an enterprise. And also, the state companies are taking into a more serious status when you are, of course, if you are a private company, you are legally a company and not only a small entrepreneur, self-employed. I will want to say something about what I think is a very important point on the questions I read. The policy of restrictions from the U.S. government to Cuba versus the policy of normalization. My feeling from the Cuban side, from Cubans that are living here, Cubans that are suffering the impacts of the crisis, I would say completely sure that the policy of restrictions is definitely damaging people, is definitely restricting the level of life of the whole population, and also is restricting the possibilities of growth for the private sector. Definitely, you could see that. I mean, we saw that from the Trump's policy when he started to block all the relationship, the tourism or whatever. The sector more, I mean, the sector that suffered the most was the private sector, because it was linkage to the market. So I would say that this is for us is very clear. The only 20 seconds if you want to if you want to follow me. Measures.
Only 20.
These measures. Okay, these measures came too late. Yes, I agree. It's too late for doing that, but nothing to do. We are here, so if we have the opportunity now, we need to go now. So I will not solve anything by saying that it's too late and somebody is guilty. Okay, and foreign retails investors. It could be a huge challenge because they are going to operate in the dollarization part of the economy. So the solution for the dual currency system is not coming to, I mean, it's not closer, but it's not on the way. And it's also a challenge for the local producers because it's supposed that all these foreign retailers are going to import a lot of things. So it's supposed a challenge. That's it. 20 seconds, as I promised.
So it were more than 20 seconds, but that's okay. I mean, we're here for that. Okay, so let's do this. I mean, let's because we don't have much time left. So I'll give you now like 2 minutes to say some last words about your topics. You know, hopefully you've gone through the questions. There are a few that are interesting. For instance, Anamari will one person in the audience asked you what measures or policies from a social reproduction point of view would look like. I mean, if you could, just mention a few of them, just to illuminate us in terms of that. Denise, well, I think you've gone through all the questions as well. You can use that time also to, answer very briefly. And Oscar, there was one in the audience that pointed out that the, restrictions in terms of private business importing from other countries. If you could also say something about that. Okay, Anamari first.
Oof, that's very difficult, but I will try. So first, what is not named cannot be addressed, right? So let's start by doing, but saying that. So a social reproduction approach will entail then and it needs to understand that all the positions of women and other groups in the labor market also depends on their positions in their reproductive duties, right? So if you don't tackle both at the same time, it is not possible then to solve the problem of, let's say, the gender gap in the labor market, right? So a social reproduction approach measure will imply not just financial resources for, give like special credits for women to start a business or something like that, but also incentives. What type of incentives the state can do, the government can have for to tackle these gaps, right? So one very obvious is, let's say, fiscal incentives for these groups that we know that now that are excluded from the non-state sector, to incentivize them to participate in that sector, right? So that's one possible thing. Other thing is that the government do the reform, let's say the most classical economic sphere, and you can liberate resources from that now the state are putting in sectors that we think that shouldn't be prioritized in this way, and you can relocate those resources to also tackle this type of policies that I was referring to. So there is a lack of transparency on how the government uses the resources, the public resources in some aspects. So we need to open that up and understand that, yes, it's a problem of growth and wealth generation, but it's also a problem of what are the priorities, and considering that investment in labor and education, health, it might not pay back in the short run, but it pays back, and we know that in the medium and long run. And Cuba is an example of that, or the biotech sector, and all the the education level and what a prepared and educated labor force can do for the future of a society.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a lot in very little. Denise, final words.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Ricardo, for giving me the word right now. And also, I'm going to try to be very quickly. But I want to, I think, combine John McAuliffe and Arturo Lopez-Levy question about policy recommendations, or whether if the Biden administration come back to the Obama's policy, what would be happening. So I think that, well, the first recommendation I would have is that it's important to keep conversations, to dialogue, to keep spaces where to share the ideas, because and to have, and also for Cuba to be included in open spaces where different countries and governments expand their points, their needs, and their policies. The other ways also, of course, the traveling with of Cuban Americans and also American citizens in general would benefit that exchange of ideas. And that is not only going through the government or for the Cuban economy, but for the people to people engagement. That is very important to see a bit beyond what you have in front of yourself, right? But I also want to touch in why policy is important and why returning remittances to operate in a way, in an expedite way, is important. Is that what we are seeing now with remittances is that a lot of Cuban Americans who cannot send money directly, they are sending through a company or an agency that is maybe in Europe. So they have to pay a transaction cost that is higher to what it would be normally. So this is affecting especially low-income migrants. And sometimes I have seen, talking to Cuban living in South Florida, for example, sometimes they are paying $25 and $30 fees to send, like, for their family to receive $100, which is a high fee cost. So in order to reduce those fee costs and, help low-income migrants who are arriving recently, I think that it's important to have agreements, government agreements regarding formal ways to send remittances from the United States to Cuba. The quickest, the better, as well as banking agreements, so the governments can be talking to the banking organizations and international organizations as well. That would lower the transaction fees, and that would also help remittances move through formal channels. That would also help as the impact of remittances for survival strategies. That would also diminish that increase that we are seeing now in irregular migration.
Okay, thank you, Denise. We've run out of time. Oscar, one final thoughts. Gotta be very concise.
Yeah, regarding the possibility of import, because there are some, like 2 or 3 questions regarding that. Private enterprises are allowed to import, and they are allowed to export. That's the first thing. The problem is that we need to do that by using the intermediation of a state company. That's the restriction we have now. But I would say that it's something that need to be eliminated. I mean, we need to be free to decide. But for instance, in our company, I would say that probably I will continue to use for certain imports or exports the state company if they give me a good service, because the fee they are charging is not really important. And if they compete and if they provide a good service, I will not have a problem to do it with them. So that's the main idea. But for instance, our company imported machinery from the United States via Canada, and we exported to Italy some of the products we produce, using in both cases a state company. And I would say the process was very quick and not more expensive than we expected. The problem is that you need to take the process by your hand, because the state company is inefficient and is not going to provide the solution as quick as you need. So if you go by yourself and do the work, which is a distortion, of course, because I contacted the fabricant, the producer, and then the provider, and then I put together the provider with the Cuban intermediate state company that was in the middle. This work should be done by the state company, but it's a possibility. So, and right now they are discussing this. They are discussing which companies, which sectors are going to have a free opportunity to make foreign trade, and they are planning to start, for instance, for the programmers and software production and renewable energy and so on. So I think this should change, but again, lack of consensus is what is blocking every new measure. That's it.
Thank you, Oscar. Well, at the end of the day, as you said, it's more a pragmatic decision than an ideological one. If the same company provides a good service, you pay for it, you go for that. Discretionality is another vice, right, of the Cuban system. Unfortunately, that will take a long time before it goes away. Okay, so now we'll run out of time. I want to thank the organizers, panelists, thank you all, and the audience for being patient as well. Thank you. I don't know if Maria Jose wants to say something. I'm done by now. Okay, see ya, bye.